Doctors of Reddit. What's your best "they came in for a small checkup and ended up needing surgery" story? Not a doctor, but a paramedic of Reddit. When I was a brand new medic, we got a call Sunday morning for a 20-something-year-old male vomiting, with a small amount of blood in the vomit. I speak 2 languages. My partner at the time was from a former Soviet bloc country and spoke about 5 fluently. Believe me when I say this guy got cursed out the entire ride to his house in 7 languages. A 20-something-year-old called because he was throwing up on a Sunday morning. Dude, you have a hangover. FFS. We arrive and are met downstairs by his girlfriend, who is panicking and confirms they went out drinking the night before. We roll our eyes, grab our gear, and head upstairs. As soon as we see the patient, our tone changes. Guy is Asian but is paler than printer paper, soaked with sweat, is cold when I touch him, and is barely conscious. I look to his bed, and a small amount of blood in the vomit is in reality a medium-sized garbage can, almost 1/4 full of straight blood. His blood pressure is low, around 70/30. His heart rate is compensating by beating at about 160 times per minute. We get a big IV in him and replace about a liter of fluid. His vitals improve. He comes around enough to answer questions. He says he drank 2 beers last night and smoked some pot. He says he has never been able to have more than a few beers without getting sick for days. I ask about his medical history, and he says he has had general digestive issues his whole life, but never anything like this. Just has to have a low-fat diet or else horrific diarrhea. Bad hemorrhoids. Low-grade abdominal pain constantly that has never been given a clear diagnosis. Nothing on paper to go from. We get him to the hospital and drop him off in critical. In one of my only true Dr. House moments, as I'm walking out, I tell the triage nurse exactly what the issue is. From the deepest depth of a half-slept-through lecture during paramedic school, I remember all these symptoms. He has an undiagnosed liver issue, which is causing blood flow through his liver to get backed up. When the liver doesn't work properly, you can't digest alcohol or fat effectively. When blood starts backing it up, causes portal hypertension, which causes hemorrhoids, and basically hemorrhoids in the esophagus, called esophageal varices. One of these varices has popped up and he was bleeding through his esophagus. One of the only time I have correctly diagnosed a problem behind, "Hey, this drunk guy has been drinking alcohol." Story 2. I remembered a second one. I teach an EMT class on the side, and we were going through rare medical conditions that you can identify with little to no equipment. Your aorta is the biggest artery in your body, and if anything happens to it, it's a big problem. You can develop an aneurysm. Think a semi-failure of the wall causing it to balloon out to the side pending full rupture. I'm explaining the ways you can identify this in the field, one of which is to take both the radial pulses, wrist, simultaneously. They should beat together. If they are beating off-tempo, that can be a sign of an aortic aneurysm. I tell everyone to partner up and take both their partner's pulses so you know what normal feels like. A hand is raised in the rear of the room. Username Sam Neal. My partner's pulses are wrong. I start by joking that students need to be more diligent in practicing taking vitals, etc., until I take the student's pulses. Hers are indeed wrong. The head instructor and I go into work mode and do a barrage of other tests. She shows additional signs in a couple, but not all the tests. We advise her to go to the hospital immediately. We explain that if you have an aortic aneurysm and it ruptures while you were on the operating table of the most skilled surgeon in the world, your odds of survival are around 2%. She refuses and finishes class after we do CYA paperwork. She follows up with her doctor from childhood who, as she tells it, drags her by ear into the ambulance he called. It turned out to be a very minor aneurysm, and she had a procedure to repair it. And it takes medication to keep her blood pressure low, but otherwise has a completely normal life. Story 3. Not a doctor, but I worked in an emergency room in nursing school. I was sitting out in triage late one night. My nurse had ran to the back for a minute and a guy comes in. Only complaint was a sore throat. Nothing else at all. Just a sore throat. But something was off. He had a slight grayish tone. As a tech, I figured, why the heck not? Told him to follow me and took him to our EKG area. Few minutes later, my nurse comes back and is looking at me like I'm nuts because I'm doing an EKG on a sore throat. I handed her the printout and she had an oh crap look. He was having a massive heart attack. My charge nurse came out later after the dust had settled and asked me what made me check him. I told her I didn't know, he just didn't look right. Intuition can be a funny thing. Poor guy, he was slightly confused about the whole thing. He just wanted something to fix his throat irritation. I have a slight feeling that all these stories are going to make me very paranoid about the smallest things. Story 4. I was the patient. I got into a 60-mile-an-hour motorcycle accident a year ago. I slammed into a guardrail. It seemed like there were no serious injuries, then some scrapes and a pain in my back. I was transported to the ER anyway. They did an x-ray, told me I had a bruised muscle, and attempted to send me on my way. Except when I sat up, I couldn't lift my butt up to put on my pants before stepping off the gurney because my back hurt so bad. They run another x-ray, do an MRI, and a few minutes later the room is flooded with doctors and nurses. I had a fractured dislocation of vertebrae T2 to T8. Basically, my spine was in half and parallel to itself. On top of this, they missed the fact that my lung had collapsed and was filling with blood. They had never seen someone like this who could still walk. I had basically won the medical equivalent of the lottery that day. I was life-flighted to a level 1 hospital in my state, and 5 hours later, and 14 inches of titanium put in my back, I was only in the hospital for 9 days and required no rehab. Edit. Here's the MRI. Here's me now. No loss of any functions, thankfully. 400th edit. A medical professional has informed me that these are CT scans and not MRIs. Sorry, it was early when I posted and I was of the dumb. 401st. And I lost 6 liters of blood. Thanks, blood donors. 402nd. Hi, Matt. I love you. Story 5. I'm the patient. I went to my doctor because I was tired. I asked to get my hormones checked, but my doctor is thorough and did a full exam and workup. During the internal exam, I'm a lady, she said she felt something weird and referred me out to an ultrasound. I had an external ultrasound and a transvaginal ultrasound that took nearly an hour with the tech snapping pictures the entire time. Super fun. Unfortunately, the ultrasound didn't show anything clearly. Whatever was wrong with me wasn't an issue with my uterus. My doctor referred me out for a CT. I went in, drank the gross goop, and they took a bunch of pictures of my pelvic region. I get a call from my doctor who says I need to meet with a surgeon right away. I get an appointment the next week. If you haven't had a CT scan done before, it's a series of images that are slices of your body shown at contrast in black and white. As the surgeon scrolled through the images, they showed the inside of my pelvic region slowly becoming full of white as he scrolled up and down my body. I had a tumor the size of a football in my pelvic region, and the only symptom that prompted me to go in was feeling so tired I couldn't finish a normal gym workout. Looking back, I also realized that I still felt like I had to go to the bathroom sometimes even though I had just gone because it was putting pressure on my bladder. They rescheduled surgery for a few weeks later. Because it was my entire pelvic region, they weren't sure what they would find when they went in, like what was the tumor, what wasn't, and what it was attached to. There were at least 3 specialists in the room with my general surgeon. It was actually much better than thought. Took about 2 hours to remove. No major organs involved other than a few internal lady bits and only minimal side effects. The biopsy showed it was benign. Well, we always love a happy ending. You know, it's good that you can actually do more extensive studies and research and try and figure out what's going on, at least with women. Like that kind of test, there's much more you can do than with a guy. It's just a simple, hey, go off to the left, huh? Yeah, you're good. Story 6. I'm not a doctor, but I still have a story. My dad had a bad stomach ache. Didn't know the cause. It was bad, but we thought it was just a bad case of food poisoning. He was in emergency and the doctor saw a burst appendix, so they took him in for surgery. Opened him up and it was stage 4 cancer. He had several tumors removed and had to go to chemo. On chemo, got better, then got worse, another surgery, deteriorating health, just pure chaos. This was 4 years ago. He died last year. Story 7. Not a doctor. This one is completely on me because I did some questionable things as a kid. I was 12, and growing up in Maine, I had a pellet gun that was advertised as shooting a 177 projectile at 1200 FPS. I had been shooting it for a few years, so my parents would let me shoot it on my own, out back as long as I wore safety glasses. That afternoon during the summer, I found a small piece of piping along the road in the front yard and brought it out back to shoot. I took the first shot and instantly felt something hit me in the head. I have a younger brother, so I thought it was a pebble or something, and put the gun down to investigate. I think the only reason I didn't immediately think I got hit by ricochet was because it didn't hurt at all. The only thing I felt was a bump, like a small rock hit me in the head. I didn't notice the blood till I wiped my face to clear what I thought was sweat. I was greeted with a completely red hand. At this point, it didn't click that I got hit by a ricochet and I didn't feel anything when I touched the cut, so I didn't worry. I couldn't stop the blood with anything outside and I couldn't find my brother, so I assumed the bullet just hit me but didn't stick, because the cut was so long. so I had to open the front door and yell for my mom. As soon as she passed the corner, she turned white and started freaking out. At this point, the blood was covering the whole front of my shirt and was starting to drip onto the ground. I told her a total lie because I didn't want them to take my pellet gun away, so I told them I hit myself with a metal pipe while flipping it in the air. She looked at my cut and could immediately tell I needed stitches, and they rushed me to the urgent care in the next city. When I got there, the towel my dad wrapped around the top of my head was showing a lot of blood. When the nurse made me take off my towel, her eyes opened wide. You could see my skull in the cut. They took me within like 10 minutes. The doctor took a look at the wound and made me tell the story again while stitching up the inch-long gash which started at my hairline at about 11 o'clock on my face. The doctor decided to take an x-ray. I waited for them to come back with the results with my dad, and after like 15 minutes the doctor came back in. He asked me to tell the story again. His next question was what kind of pipe shoots metal 4 inches under your scalp. He made me tell the real story and showed my dad the x-ray, and my dad was visibly upset. The next thing I knew, I was in an ambulance on my way to the OR. Those guys didn't even put me to sleep while they cut into my scalp and pulled out a perfectly circular saw-shaped piece of mushroom lead that was almost 5 inches from the entrance point. They couldn't remove one of the fragments because of its location, and it was small. My pellet rifle still got taken away. This is like the Red Ryder BB gun on steroids. Glad the kid's okay. Story 8. Actually a doctor. Pediatrician. So many stories. Teenager comes in for ear pain and turns out there was a hornet stuck in the ear biting the crap out of his canal and eardrum. Had to have it surgically repaired. Kid comes into ER for a cough for a couple weeks. Parents are very worried and the kid looks off, so I order a chest x-ray. His mediastinum, the white part between the lungs, takes up almost the entirety of his chest. Massive tumor. Kid with belly pain and vomiting for 12 hours. Belly exam is hard, not like she is flexing, but like rigid as a board. Ultrasound for appendicitis shows a massive kidney tumor that went from right lung to bottom of the right pelvis. Wilms tumors are crazy. Most recently had a little one in for a regular checkup that parents had kept postponing. Kid can't sit up alone and parents still have to feed. Not normal for a 9-month. Ultrasound of the head shows too much water in the brain and the kid gets surgery within 24 hours. You know, I always wanted to be a veterinarian growing up, but I didn't think I had it in me to deliver bad news of the family's pet back to them. I can't imagine what it's like to be a pediatrician. You gotta deliver stuff like that to them? Like, that's heartbreaking. Story 9. Doctor here. I had one a few months ago sent into the hospital by his primary care doctor with shoulder pain. He said he felt absolutely fine, just a really uncomfortable right shoulder pain that hadn't gone away for a couple of weeks. He maybe felt a bit more tired than usual and, oh, come to think of it, had lost quite a bit of weight recently and none of his clothes fit him anymore. I went to examine him and had what we describe in the profession as a heart sink moment. He was jaundiced and his abdomen was absolutely solid in the right upper zone from a huge craggy liver. Get him in the CT scanner and he is just full of cancer. Everywhere. Couldn't even work out which was the primary. The shoulder pain is what we call referred pain and is commonly caused by diaphragmatic irritation. In this case, from all the liver masses pushing against it. Bless him. I think about him a lot. Story 10. I was the patient, not the doctor. September a few years back, I was working 20-hour days in an office chair during crunch time for a big event. The day before the big event, in a remote desert location, similar to but not Burning Man, I did another all-nighter and took an hour nap before last push prior to travel. I woke up unable to lift my arms. The feeling of an elephant standing on my chest and a headache when I never get headaches. My husband took me to urgent care, where I was diagnosed with acid reflux, given a painkiller shot in my butt, handed a Dixie cup of something chalky and awful, and sent home. I finished my work and went a day late to the big event. I spent 5 days walking around in 110-degree heat doing my job, still unable to lift my arms, but otherwise got through it. A few months later, I went to the club with friends and danced all night. The next morning, my calf hurt pretty badly. Thought maybe I'd pulled my calf muscle. Over the next 2 days, the calf pain got worse and worse until the day before Christmas, I pulled out some old crutches. My husband wanted to hit up the climbing gym, so I went along and hung out with all our friends while they climbed. We stopped by urgent care right after. I was unable to put any weight on my leg at this point. The doctor did a quick exam and put my leg in a compression boot. Told me it was a muscle tear or sprain and had to keep it iced and elevated for a few days. The nurse waited for the doctor to leave and pulled us aside. She She said she had a strange feeling about it and asked if we'd be willing to go have an emergency ultrasound done at a nearby hospital. We figured it wouldn't hurt, just in case. While in the ultrasound text room, a lovely Russian-born tech started out cheery and making jokes with us. About 5 minutes in, she got quiet and excused herself. Moments later, a doctor came in, looked at the screen, and told me not to move. There was an 8-centimeter blood clot in my leg. I was moved to a gurney and rushed to the ER in the same hospital. The ER doc said I was incredibly lucky. He sent me for a CT scan of my chest just to be sure, saying it was just precaution. Turned out I had 7 pulmonary emboli in my right lung and 5 in my left. When he saw the results, he had the talk with us explaining the gravity of the situation. I spent 4 months in my bed on blood thinners, not allowed to move while the clot resolved, with 3 additional ER visits due to cardiac incidents from blood clot bits breaking off and pushing through my heart. The doc said it was most likely due to the number of emboli in my lungs and the size and the placement of the clot that I'd likely had it back in September. And what was diagnosed as acid reflux was actually another piece of clot triggering a cardiac incident. And that is the story of how my noodle arms and calf sprain turned out to be deep vein thrombosis with multiple pulmonary emboli. I am still very glad to be here and to type to total strangers about it. If that nurse hadn't second-guessed the doctor on Christmas Eve, I would probably not be. Just goes to show the power of a second opinion. Story 11. Not a doctor, but the patient. Went in to get my shoulder looked at because my rotator cuff was being a bit of a loser. No one had looked at me shirtless in at least a few years beforehand. So imagine the collective surprise when we discovered my mild scoliosis had progressed to a visible deformation. I just got extra unlucky in that I developed an 84 curve one way and an 85 curve the other way. So I never developed the telltale scoliosis lean. Ended up having spinal fusion done within 5 months because it would have been dangerous to do it any later. You know, I actually haven't heard a lot about the severity of scoliosis, and I know a lot of people who have it. Some of them are really good at Twister, but is it like life-threatening or can it be? I genuinely don't know. Tell me down below. Story 12. Oh boy. As part of our medical course, we need cannulas ticked off. Another medical student and I went to the ED where many patients need cannulas. We found a fantastic nurse willing to supervise us, who recommended a patient with easy veins, e.g. young, no urgent problem. Young woman with vague 3 out of 10 abdominal pain was triaged low down on the list, so she was perfect. It was the other medical student's turn, so she begins rummaging through the drawers for equipment. It's apparent she doesn't know what she's looking for, so the nurse helps. Student sets out an enormous needle, 14G, the kind you'd use for a blood transfusion. Nurse gives her a weird look and replaces it with a smaller one. It becomes apparent this is the student's first cannula. After poking several random areas, she enters the vein. And then she does nothing. Doesn't release the tourniquet, doesn't put a bung cap on it, does nothing while looking at the pathology tubes blankly. The nurse is telling her to put a cap on it, but the student is still obviously trying to figure out whether to attach the pink or the yellow tube. Blood is gushing out. The nurse tries to hand her a cap, student doesn't notice. Patient finally looks down, blood everywhere. Over her arm, the bluey, towel placed under the arm, chair reaching her pants. The patient's face goes ghost white. Even her lips turn white. Her eyes roll back into her head. Before I know it, she's passed out. The cannula still isn't capped. The nurse is desperately trying to hurdle over the student in the trolley to cap the cannula or take it out. Student is still standing there, not moving out of the way. Flummoxed, I grab another nurse and we find a bed to transfer the patient onto and elevate her legs. The patient is rolled into resus, where there are bigger bays. There's so much blood on the floor that the wheels of the bed left a long red trail across the emergency department. In handover later, I heard she was hypovolemic, and they were keeping her for a while until her red blood cell count was returned, to confirm she wasn't anemic from all the blood loss. Too long didn't read. Woman came in with vague abdominal pain, ended up admitted for violent blood loss. Afterwards, I heard the student asking the nurse if she would tick her off for the cannula. I'm like 99% sure it's pronounced cannula, but I had said it wrong the first couple times and just decided to commit. Story 13. A couple years ago, my mom was experiencing crazy back pains. She went to this one doctor every so often to get some pain medication, and that doctor, for the life of him, couldn't find anything wrong with her, but could tell she was experiencing major pain, so gave it to her. One day she's going in again and her doctor is out, so she has a different one. While being checked up, the doctor says, "So you're here for the broken back then?" And my mom was really confused. Apparently, in 1999, she had been in a car accident where a tanker truck carrying gas rolled over her car and crushed her inside, but nobody had apparently noticed that her back was broken for almost 16 years. She had surgery on the day of my birthday, and she's been a happier and more easygoing person ever since. That freaking sucks so bad. But you know what kind of beast of a woman your mom has to be to go 16 years with a broken back? Alright, now if there was any debate on what kind of pain tolerance was better between men versus women, not only can they deliver children, but 16 freaking years? Put some respect on that. Glad she's feeling better though. Story 14. I was/am the patient. I work construction for a living and was working a job removing some very heavy laminated glass. Strenuous lifting all day long. During the course of the gig, my left testicle began to swell and hurt and wasn't getting any better. I told my supervisor I suspected I had given myself a hernia, not unheard of in my field, and went to the occupational health care clinic in town. The sweetest grandmotherly physician did the whole turn your head and cough deal. Awkward, necessary, but yielded nothing. She recommends I check myself into the emergency room and get an ultrasound. Well, when the ultrasound tech finishes the session by saying, "Good luck to you, buddy," I suspected something was amiss. Well, one removed testicle, a round of chemotherapy, and an abdominal lymph node removal later, testicular cancer hasn't beaten me down. I'm awaiting my 4-month post-surgery CAT scan now. Fellas, check your nuts. Story 15. Not me. Not a doctor, but a friend who is the definition of anti-establishment, anti-vax, anti-anything science-backed, always had a little bump on her nose. She put her oils on it, smudged it with sage to remove the toxins, and regarded it as her beautiful bump. The bump gets bigger, darker. Her grandmother supposedly tricks her into going to the doc about it. I think she was supposed to be helping Grandma to her own appointment, but sneaky Grandma had other plans. Anyway, Miss Alles Cure Everything is currently in hospital having the entire left side of her nostril and part of her cheek removed due to skin cancer. You know, I'm not a fan of the whole I told you so thing when it comes to all the anti-vax, anti-doctor, anti-this or that people, you know, unless they're a douche about it on their side and be like, well, I would never trust. But otherwise, if they're just trying to do their own thing, I'm never going to celebrate when someone else has something go wrong. Story 16. Obligatory, not a doctor. This happened to an old coworker of mine. I was a supervisor at a truck terminal. One of our delivery drivers was moving a pallet in his truck when the wheel of the jack caught some debris on the floor of the trailer and he pulled something in his abdomen. He went to the doctor either that evening or the next day, and in the middle of the exam, the doctor basically just stopped and told him to go to the hospital, like, right away. It turned out he had a baseball-sized tumor in his abdomen, and it wound up being malignant. He died like half a year later. Rip Jimmy. Jeez, that escalated so fast. My condolences. That freaking sucks. Story 17. 14-year-old cancer survivor comes in for his routine post-chemo screening echocardiogram. His heart was barely moving. I don't remember the EF, probably in the low teens. We sat him and his mom and told them some bad news. Put EMLA on his arm for a PICC and walked him to the cardiac ICU. A few months later, he has a heart transplant. Kids, man. They can look great on the outside when compensated, then you look at the images and just get nauseous for them. Scariest thing about pediatrics and #1 reason why kids need kid doctors. Story 18. Not a doctor, but my dad had a bit of pain that wouldn't go away 3 years ago. Sat through all of Christmas morning, then as soon as my family and my sister's family left, he took himself to the emergency room, I grant, but only because it was Christmas, so there weren't any walk-in clinics open. ER was the only choice. He had freaking pancreatic cancer, and in the end, he got the Whipple procedure done, then chemo after, and latest news from his doctors is that it's 100% gone, which is phenomenal for pancreatic. Edit. He was super lucky there were any symptoms at all early enough for it to matter. Story 19. When I was 2, I had a really bad ear infection and fever, so my parents took me to the doctor's office. Turns out I had an infection in both ears, my sinuses, something going on with my tonsils, remember that for later, and a fever of 104 and climbing. My parents ended up getting some antibiotics and everything cleared up for a while. But then for the next few months, all of that would come back and then go away again. Remember my tonsils? Those effers were why I was getting so sick. I can't remember exactly how, but they were causing all of these infections. So my parents took me to the hospital and I had surgery to have them removed. Then the doctor almost killed me by giving me too much anesthesia. So there's that too. Story 20. The reason there aren't a lot of responses from doctors is probably because when we see our patients, the thought process is never, this person is here for a small problem. We are constantly thinking, what is the worst possible thing this person could have right now? How do I make sure these things are not happening? So when we discover something serious, it was already something we were worried about and trying to rule out. I try to think of every problem as a big problem until I'm absolutely sure it's not. Anywho, my contribution to the thread. I saw an elderly lady for a sore toe, and when I asked her to take off her shoes, both of her feet were cold, purple, and pulseless from a loss of blood supply. Cue urgent CT and a vascular surgery consult. She saw me in a walk-in clinic, so I'm not sure how she did, but the surgeon I spoke to did think they would be able to save her feet. I'm sure there's a nervous joke about cold feet in here somewhere, but I want to make sure she was actually able to save them first. Story 21. Not a doctor, but I've got two stories where I thought I was fine / being ridiculous over the whole thing. First one, I thought I had a really bad period cramp, which kept getting worse to the point I couldn't walk. Turns out I had an ovarian cyst burst on me, and I spent 6 hours in the waiting room hunched over in a wheelchair because the nurses thought I was just trying to get out of school. Second time, I just thought I had a sore throat. Did the strep test and everything, which came back negative at the walk-in clinic. It proceeded to get so bad that I couldn't swallow, and I was vomiting up whatever I ate, but I was determined that I was just being a wimp over the whole thing. My sister came home, felt my forehead, and immediately called our grandparents to take me to the hospital. I sat in the ER for 4 hours because she made me take an all-in-one sort of thing for sore throats, which also included reducing fevers. So the nurses probably thought I was being ridiculous. Turns out I had cellulitis in my uvula and it had swollen to 3 times its usual size. Don't know how I got it, but work sure was thrilled about me calling in sick for a whole week during busy season. There's a difference between your soft palate and your throat, and that definitely makes a difference when doctors are trying to diagnose you. Of all that, what's so stupid is that the ovarian cyst burst and she's stuck in school because the nurses are like, don't try and get out of math class, huh? I feel like no matter what the case, even if they were faking it, if someone's like, I'm in horrible pain, just send them home. Story 22. Not a doctor and not me, but my dad. I took him to the hospital for a checkup prior to a planned knee surgery. The knee had been playing up for years, so he needed to get a new one. It was just a routine check and pretty boring, so I was in the waiting area outside. While my dad got his knee looked at, the doctor also noticed a red, bloody mosquito bite on his right forearm and asked my dad about it. Dad told him that it's nothing to worry about. It's just a mosquito bite that he scratched until it bled. The doctor has a short look at it and calls me into the office. Doctor, I'm afraid, but we need to do surgery on that bite. It needs to be opened and cleaned. Dad, no worries. I'll schedule an appointment for that on my way out. Doctor, no, you don't understand. We are preparing the surgery for you now. When did you last have something to eat? Turns out the arm was severely infected. They cut his arm open and he had to stay in the hospital for almost 2 weeks while they drained loads of nasty fluids out of his arm. If the checkup would have been a couple of days later, he might have died from blood poisoning. Uh-oh. Paranoia's setting in, and it's mosquito season. Story 23. Not a doctor yet, but a student. I haven't seen the worst kind of stuff yet, but this was a fun one. I'm shadowing a GP at her office, and a guy comes in for a routine checkup a few weeks after surgery on his toe for an ingrown nail. Doctor asks, how's he doing? Guy's like, fine, I guess, a little tender. She says, okay. How does it look when he clears it? Guy says he doesn't know. Turns out he was still in the same dressing they gave him at the hospital after the surgery. Never even opened it. Had just been walking around in the filthy thing for weeks. Even the experienced doctor was struggling to keep a neutral face when she opened that dressing and the smell came. It was bad. Story 24. I am not a doctor, but friends of mine took their baby in for his 1-year checkup. Doctor did the typical shine a bright light in the eyes, and within 60 seconds picked up the phone and called an ambulance to take them to the airport for the next flight across the continent to Toronto to the world-leading 6 Kids Retinoblastoma Eye Cancer Center. Ambulance waiting at Toronto Airport, straight to the Sick Kids Hospital and into surgery. Apparently it was moving so fast if just another few days had passed, it might have been too late. They removed the baby's eye. The cancer never reoccurred, and he is now a healthy, cancer-free adult. Even crazier was the nurse in England who saw only a photo of a baby on social media with one eye white and alerted the parents the baby had eye cancer. Eye cancer and other eye disease can turn one of the child's eyes white in photos taken with a flash. So if you see this in photos, it's a good idea to have a doctor take a look. I assume everybody else has got their notepad out because that is information I did not have. Story 25. Not a doctor, however, I feel I have a good example to contribute. A couple of years ago, my grandfather was complaining about minor chest pain. He said it was only when it was cold outside and he found it a little hard to breathe. This is the first time in his life this happened, so he didn't know what it was. We ended up taking him to the doctor, expecting it to do with the cold weather taking a toll on his 81-year-old body. After a couple appointments, he found out he needed a triple bypass. In very brief terms, for those who don't know, a triple bypass is clearing any obstruction from 3 of the 4 sections of your heart. Had we not taken him in for this small doctor's appointment, who knows how much longer he had before the lack of blood stopped his heart. He got the surgery ASAP, and he's still alive and well today. Story 26. Another not a doctor story. My dad always had some back pain because of his job as a mason. One day he came home and it was just a bit more intense. He then took a hot bath like he always did and went to bed early because the pain didn't get better. The next morning the pain was still there, so he was like, screw it, I'm going to see the doc and get my day off. Doctor did some checks and a few minutes later he was rushed to the hospital with a severe heart attack. I still wonder how he took it quite easily because it almost killed him. Now, 15 years later, he's fine and never had any problems besides short breath and being physically weaker. Always trust a mason's intuition or something like that. Whatever happened in his brain that made him go get checked out and saved his life. I think the moral of the story might just be try and get a day off. Story 27. Not a doctor, but a patient. I had taken martial arts for much of my youth, with the plan of taking it professionally after college. During college, I visited my grandfather for a family reunion, who was an MD, general practice, to give you an idea of how long ago it was. He noted a lump on the side of my jaw, and I just shrugged and figured it was part of doing martial arts. Occasionally, you dodge poorly and you get tagged harder than you'd prefer. He asked me, as a favor, to see an associate of his. Deciding to humor him, I went. So he subjected me to an FNA, fine needle aspiration, also known as needle biopsy, or in common language, jab this huge freaking needle in your jaw until it scrapes bone and see what comes out. Then an MRI and a CAT scan. Well, results were concerning but inconclusive because the swelling from the FNA obscured the results of the MRI and CAT. Do it again. Did it again in the right order this time. After some ominous he referred me to someone he knew out at MD, Anderson. Turns out it was periosteosarcoma, or cancerous tumor growing out of the jawbone for those of us who did not take Latin. So yeah, prognosis went from bone bruise to bone cancer. That was not the most pleasant discovery of my life. Fortunate, of course, but not particularly pleasant. Story 28. Not a doctor, but a patient. I was in school and caught a cold. It wasn't going away for a while, but I didn't really notice it because I was so focused on schoolwork. Eventually, I went to the doctor because I developed a little bit of a cough. And since I have asthma, colds that affect my respiratory system are horrible. I go to the school's medical center and get triaged by a nurse. She takes my temperature while asking a few questions and looks puzzled. Takes it again and asks me if I'm uncomfortable. I tell her something like, "No, I got this cough." She tells me, "Your temperature is 104.6. You don't feel hot?" I didn't. After triage, I was first priority to see the doctor. She tells me that my tonsils are huge and that I most likely have strep throat, even though my strep test came back negative. So she prescribes me antibiotics and an electrolyte solution and sends me on my way. That night, I'm drinking that Gatorade electrolyte stuff, but my friend is holding the cup. My body is shaking violently, and even though I took a prescribed fever reducer, my temperature kept going up. I thought I'd just sweat it out and the antibiotics would take effect soon. I began hallucinating shadowy figures, and the room became hazy. My friend's walking looked like stop motion. I went to the hospital with my friend after I told them what I was seeing, and after he noticed my fever was still rising regardless of the medication. We went to the ER and they did blood work, cultures, x-ray, and a physical exam. They gave me IV fluids to bring my fever down from 105.4 to 100-ish. The doctor diagnosed me with some unknown virus and said, "Good thing I went to the ER. If I hadn't, the fever could have caused me to seize and give me brain damage." Long story short, It was not a cough, just a crazy virus that could have killed a part of my brain. If there's one thing I got out of that story is that not even Gatorade can cure a crazy fluke virus. Although Powerade is still in question. Story 29. Not following the rules of the thread, but a girl from my high school was on vacation with her family somewhere in the Caribbean and went to the hospital for what they figured was a mild, serious jellyfish sting that was bothering her. I guess after some evaluation, the doctor came out and said, "Good news! I think we can save the leg. If you get stung by a jellyfish at all, you're in trouble." Story 30. My mother was the patient. She and my grandmother had been in a car accident with a drunk driver, and we were being checked out for whiplash and such. As they're signing discharge papers, a surgeon comes running into the room and says my mother can't leave. Apparently, she was missing her top 3 vertebrae. Her neck was being held in place purely by muscle. She was one of a handful of people ever found with this problem past the age of 2, and most are only found on autopsy. So they ended up taking a chunk of her hip bone, sculpting it, then fusing it all together with enough wires to set off metal detectors for years. Story 31. I am the patient. Went to my doctor complaining about leg pain in September, to the point where I couldn't continue working out. Got an x-ray that showed pelvic tilt. I did what they asked. Pain continued. Went back in October, got an ultrasound that showed bursitis and tendinitis. I did physio, but it didn't help. Pain continued. In January, I went to a new doctor. She diagnosed me with a second tendinitis and gave me an MRI. Tendinitis treatment didn't help. Had an MRI a few days ago. It revealed a 3-centimeter Tarlov cyst at the bottom of my spine. We'll need surgery to remove it. Story 32. I went to the after-hours A&E center quack about a cough I had from a bad flu. As part of the visit, she went to put the stethoscope on my back to listen to my heart, and she said, "Oh? What's this?" And I said, "That's just a small fungal rash I've had for a year and haven't bothered getting looked at." Turns out she was the local skin cancer doctor and I had a basal cell carcinoma. Had to get surgery to cut it out of my back in 2 layers of 12 stitches to seal it back up. It's been about 2 months and I still can't reach forward to my keyboard very well. But I can say I have been stabbed in the back and have the scar to prove it. Story 33. Not a doctor, but the patient in question. Last December, a week before Christmas, I made a doctor's appointment because my hemorrhoids flared up, and I noticed a decent amount of blood in my stool. Right before I left to go to the doctor, I threw up. I drove to the clinic, clutching my abdomen in agony. It took me a few minutes to get myself out of the car, but I did, and also managed to get my kids, 2-month-old and 17-month-old son, out of the car. But as we were crossing the street, I suddenly felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my abdomen and doubled over in pain. A lady who had stopped for me while I crossed the street with my kids got out of her vehicle and helped me get my kids into the clinic. Since I was doubled over in pain, the nurses rushed me into a room and helped keep my kids, mostly my son, occupied. They ended up sending me up to the hospital. Luckily, my stepmom worked 2 blocks away and was able to walk over to drive me up. My boyfriend was working out of town at the time and rushed home to help me and the kids. We discovered that my crippling pain was from a gallbladder attack. Since it was a week before Christmas, I had to wait until the new year to get the problem taken care of. In fact, I just had my gallbladder out last week. Story 34. Lady came into the ED with substernal exertional chest pain that she'd had for a day or so, but she had never had it before prior to this episode. She was active, shoveled snow regularly over the winter, etc. It just came on out of nowhere. In the ED, had a mild trop evaluation of 0.06. I thought, okay, indeterminate trop, but whatever. We'll throw her on a heparin drip, ASA, etc., and we'll see if she has cath in the morning versus stress test. Her chest pain stopped and I figured it would be non-cardiac since she had been tolerating serious exertion without pain up until yesterday. But her trops didn't stop going up. They went up and up, peaking later that night in the low hundreds, and her EKG clearly showed NSTEMI. She went for cath and had horrible multivessel disease with tons of collaterals. Stenting would be insufficient, but there weren't any good targets for CABG either. She ended up getting listed for heart transplant. Too long didn't read. Previously very active lady came in for a twinge of chest pain with exertion and ended up having to get listed for heart transplant due to the widespread and inoperable nature of her failing coronaries. I don't think I understood a single word that I just read, but I hope she's doing well. Story 35. The patient here went to the doctors for minor tonsillitis. However, I had been getting it quite frequently and he recommended getting my tonsils removed. So I arrive at the hospital to get my tonsils out. Surgery happens and I wake up in my bed struggling to breathe. They insisted that I was just tired. I tried to get out of my bed and instantly collapsed. A nurse rushed in and started doing her vital signs. Turns out I was breathing quite frequently and heavily. The doctor comes in and checks me and over again and finds out that during the surgery I had pneumonia and as a result my lung had collapsed, leading me to stay in hospital for another 2 weeks. Story 36. My wife in her 3rd trimester. Her blood pressure had been going up, so she was assigned bed rest over the weekend. On Sunday, I flew across the country to a training class for my new job. On Monday, wifey goes to the OB. They measure her BP and it's astronomical, like 160/120 or something. She's in full preeclampsia. You need to go to the ER right now. She went to the ER, did 5 rounds of, lithium? Can't remember which element they gave you. None of it worked, so they did an emergency cesarean. Our kiddo was 9 weeks premature and spent the next month in the NICU. Meanwhile, I was frantically trying to get home. I was sitting in the airport in Minneapolis while all of that was happening. Story 37. It happened to us. We took our daughter for a scheduled well baby check. She had a strange little bruise on her head that we wanted to ask about. Plus, it was time for vaccines, etc. Left 2 hours later by ambulance to PEDS ICU. She had a brain tumor the size of my fist. The bruise was caused by pressure inside her skull. A few more days and she likely would have had major symptoms, seizures, etc. We were totally dumbstruck and had no idea there was a problem. 12 surgeries, 2 years of chemo, and years of therapy have her doing pretty well. She has permanent disabilities, but she's happy and relatively healthy. Story 38. Not surgery, but I had a guy come into the emergency after an unwitnessed collapse. He was young, early 50s, but had been diagnosed with a myriad of what are often known as exclusionary diagnoses, such as chronic fatigue syndrome, if nothing else can be found to relate to a patient's symptoms despite numerous investigations. From what I could discern, he'd been seeing his doctor for years for motor symptoms and had weakness, and they'd always told him it was all in his head. Well, they weren't wrong. I did a scan and found a bleeding tumor? Tried to follow up, but as far as I could determine, he's self-discharged. Definitely explained all the symptoms he'd been experiencing all these years. Story 39. A few years ago, I had a really bad eye infection and it ended up permanently reshaping one of my irises. Went to an optometrist to see what's up and they did some tests and recommended I get it checked out by specialists at the hospital. Finally got around to going and they said I had to stay there for a few days and run a bunch of tests. Was there for a week and had a heap of different tests run, bunch of blood taken, and tested for pretty much any relevant disease. They never figured out what the real cause was, but told me part of my eye was folded under and stuck to another part so my iris can't contract properly and is kind of flat on one side. They gave me steroid eye drops to try and fix it, but it hasn't done anything. My vision is mostly unaffected besides some issues in weird lighting and depth perception / focusing sometimes. But I've got some cool looking eyes because my other one is basically always contracted, heaps to counteract the broken one. Story 40. Oh, I have 2. Although, to be fair, neither of them are small checkups. Also, not a doctor. My mom, after years of lifting and carrying children, began to experience back pain. After a few months, she decided enough was enough and went to the doctor and got diagnosed with some spinal damage or another, I don't quite recall. But while they were there scanning her torso, you know what they found? Early stage kidney cancer. And so everything worked out better because of the injury. My grandmother's story is shorter. She was working at the counter and all of a sudden she lost her words, had a stroke. Bad news. She got rushed to the hospital and thankfully has mostly recovered from the event. But while they were there looking at her brain, they found not 1 but 2 aneurysms in her brain just waiting to pop. Seriously, what are the chances of this happening twice? That is good news, to have 2 people suffer these crazy instances and then get diagnosed with some underlying issues that needed to be resolved. That's good fortune. However, I would feel a little worried knowing that it's my grandmother and my mother and it feels like issues are running in the family. So Please be proactive and take care of yourself. Story 41. I was the patient. Woke up super early one morning when I was 22 years old with terrible heartburn. Took some Alka-Seltzer. Woke up a couple hours later to go work a 10-hour shift. Get back to the apartment after work and the heartburn has slowly been coming and going away all day. It finally peaks after 12 hours of the initial symptoms, so I ask my roommate if he will take me to the ER. As much as I despised the idea of it. Even at the ER, everyone just assumed it was really bad acid reflux since I was just 22 with no prior medical conditions. The nurse hooks me up to an EKG, then went and immediately got a doctor. One heart cath later found out I had viral pericarditis. The virus caused the sac that surrounds a person's heart to get inflamed and put pressure on the heart, resulting in heart attack symptoms. Stayed in the ICU for a couple of days and then a regimen for inflammation for a couple of months till the thing worked its way through my system. Story 42. Not a doctor, but my former girlfriend constantly felt tired. She was diagnosed with mono, chronic fatigue syndrome, everything in the book. She went in for a routine physical. When they checked her BP, it was like 230/120, so the doctor's office called 911 and she was rushed by the ambulance to the ER. There, they diagnosed her with pulmonary arterial hypertension and she would need a heart transplant. A week later, she died on the operating table during a cardiac catheterization surgery. It was a week from I'm tired to dying. Only 21. Really sucked. Story 43. Earlier this week, I did an ultrasound on a middle-aged woman for yearly screening for ovarian cancer, as it ran in her family. She has no symptoms. We typically only look at the uterus and ovaries on a pelvic ultrasound, but while imaging, I noticed she had a bladder tumor. I imaged that as well, and after she was sent to a specialist. She came into my department yesterday to thank me. She was crying. She had brought me a card and wine and chocolate thanking me for finding something they didn't know to look for. I'm an ultrasound tech, not a doctor. Story 44. My dad started having some back pains just over a year ago. Went to get out of his chair to get ready for work one morning and just falls down because it sent severe pain and loss of strength through his back to his lower left leg. He described it to me and it sounded exactly like the issues I've had with sciatica, so we load him in the car and take him to see the doctors. They give him a course of steroids and have him back in a couple of days because the sudden loss of so much strength in his leg concerns them, and they know he's always had extremely high pain tolerance. To give you an example, he had diverticulitis that required very long surgery and worked for a week before the pain got too much for him to handle. Anyway, a few days go by, still no improvement. He was actually still losing strength in his leg and could pretty much not use it at all anymore. His doctor thinks it's a spinal issue and gets him into a specialist in 2 days. The next day, the lack of strength has spread to his other leg and he's too dang stubborn to go to the hospital because I'm seeing a specialist tomorrow. With him being a 340-pound, 6'6" man, we had to call in friends to help get him into the car for his appointment because he's lost almost all strength in both legs at this point. The doctors see him for about 5 minutes before calling an ambulance to take him to the ER because the rapid spreading of the strength loss is an emergency in their eyes. He gets admitted to the hospital and I go home that night because they're going to do tests the next day and I have to work. I call my mom a few times to ask what they found out, and the answer at point changes from, "We're still not sure," to, "We'll talk when you get here." So I left work and rushed to the hospital as fast as I could because I knew that was bad. Stage 4 kidney cancer, which had spread to his lungs and lymph nodes and caused a tumor to compress a lot of nerves on his spine, which is why he lost strength in his legs so quickly. He never did walk again, was only able to transfer to a wheelchair to even get out of bed a handful of times that summer between so many other health issues coming up, and passed away the morning after seeing his beloved Patriots win the Super Bowl this year. Oh, that's tough. My condolences. This sounds pretty similar to my dad, and it's not easy. So I hope you're doing well, and thank God for Tom Brady giving your dad one last, peaceful win. Story 45. Doctor here. My clinic is in an interesting area, so I have a ton of stories. But this is the most recent I can think of. I had a patient come in for an annual physical. She hadn't been seen in a long while, like 15 years, but decided it was time to come back in and get checked out just in case. Huge red flag. Through the interview, she's insisting everything is fine. No complaints in particular, maybe some weight gain, but nothing unexpected. Then comes the physical. I can barely hear her heart sounds. I swear she's got a heart rate of like 10. Lungs sound like crap. Get to her legs. She's obese, but her legs seem weirdly huge for her size. Try to lift up her pant leg. Can't. too tight. She has to pull her pants down, at which point I see she has ace bandaged both of her legs from ankle to thigh, and her feet are black and ice cold. They are dead and gangrenous at this point. I unwrap some of the bandage and her shins are blue. I'm freaking out at this point. She tells me her legs swell sometimes and started turning blue a couple of weeks ago. She heard wrapping was good for that, so she's been doing this for weeks. It really hurt her feet in the beginning, but now she can't feel it, so it must be working. So with much protest, I finally get this woman to the ED. Bedside ultrasound of her heart shows it's basically completely failed, but that she's somehow still alive. Ends up in cardiac ICU, required both feet partially amputated and a device placed to help her pump blood forward. Good news is, she survives. I see her back like 3 months later. She still doesn't understand what the big deal was. I was doing fine with my wraps, begrudgingly took her medications, and actually got enough function back that she didn't need a transplant. The human body is amazing. That's kind of insane. But, like, does she know that you guys saved her life, or is she still, like, mad that you just amputated her feet? Story 46. When I was in high school, I was feeling sick for like a week. When I was that age, I was a pretty big hypochondriac. So I got my mom to make me an appointment. Had to have a sub-doc, and they definitely cared more than my primary. She looked at my records to, see if anything was wrong with me since she's not my main doctor. She came back and said that the EKG that I had last year was abnormal, and if I got it checked out. We did not because it was said to be perfectly normal. Fast forward a couple of months later and I'm having a minor heart surgery. Story 47. About 10 years ago, I was helping in the fast track area of a suburban ER. This is usually for uncomplicated stuff, lacerations, headaches, twisted ankles, etc. Triage nurse sends back a 70-year-old man with back pain who had been raking leaves all day. She figured he'd just need a muscle relaxer and maybe some pain meds and be out the door. Palpating his back didn't elicit any tenderness. Not a big deal. Decided to do an abdominal exam and he had a large pulsatile mass in his abdomen. Turned out to be a 14-centimeter aortic aneurysm that hadn't yet ruptured. Vascular surgeon came in at 10 p.m. begrudgingly and saved his life. Story 48. 21-year-old me, stomach cramps for 2 weeks, proper constipated, it's Aeon's release date, oh boy, it's gonna kill, wow! Drive to town to pick it up, man, I'm feeling proper ill, like mega flu or something. Set game to install, figure I'll have a nap. Wake up, proper sweating, proper ill, go to the doctors. While being examined, tell him I gotta puke bad. I vomit in his sink, it's brown and it looks like poop. Long story short, rushed to the hospital from the doctor's surgery in an ambulance. They thought it was appendicitis. Cool, get some time off work. I can live with this. Go in for surgery, all gravy baby. Wake up in intensive care unit barely able to move in total agony with a stoma and crap sack on my side. Turns out I had septicemia from a perforated bowel caused by some serious diverticulitis. Apparently I was super lucky to be alive and was in agony but just ignored it for 2 weeks. And if I'd waited any longer, then I had to go to the doctors, I'd be dead. This was 10 years ago now. Tell you what, boys, until you can't take a crap for 8 months, you'll never appreciate how good it feels to take a crap. I used to get phantom scraps where I'd have to go to the loo and not crap to alleviate the feeling. The only plus side is I could game without the need for a crap all day. Shame Aeon was a crap game though. Holy crap, or holy wow, how does that even happen? But game on, brother. Game on. Story 49. Not a doctor, this is my dad's story. He had a lap band surgery years earlier and was plateauing in his weight loss. He started a medically approved, mostly liquid diet to help shrink his stomach again. After a couple of months of the diet, he noticed that he was both losing weight much more quickly than he expected and was having trouble swallowing/keeping food down. He went in for an esophageal scan, EGD, to check if his stomach had shrunk too much. It was stage 4 esophageal cancer. It had already spread to his liver. He was given 2 years with treatment, 1 year without. We are now 1.5 years out from his diagnosis and he's fully in remission. Feeling great. Story 50. I work at a vet clinic. I know this is more geared towards human doctors, but veterinarians are doctors too. I've had some recently that were pretty bad. We had a 5-year-old dog come in for a cough that had progressed for a couple of months, getting winded, but acting fine, eating, drinking, being a happy bear. We did x-rays expecting pneumonia from kennel cough. He was littered with tumors in his lungs and had a week to go. We also had a Labrador in for an anal gland expression. When my tech went in, we felt a nodule and couldn't express his gland. He had surgery to get it removed the next week. Turned out to be adenocarcinoma that was malignant. Story 51. I was misdiagnosed by my GP for 2 weeks. I was in a meeting when all of a sudden I felt like I wanted to throw up everywhere, which was mixed with some cold sweats and a pain in my gut. I went to see him and he said it could be appendicitis. I was then sent for a scan to see if it was, and it came back clear, so he sent me home saying I probably had a virus. But day after day it got worse and worse. So I went back to him and again he said, "These viruses sometimes take time to leave your system." Eventually I went back to him and said, "Please just give me something." He put me on a course of antibiotics. I decided I needed a second opinion and went to a gastroenterologist. He did a scan and said to me, "I literally can't see your insides. I have to open you up to see what's going on." Long story short, I had a 2-hour OP. I had an ever so slight tear in my appendix. It leaked into my body for 2 weeks, poisoning my system. He told me he had to take my guts out of my body to clean them. He said if I didn't go on that course of antibiotics, I would have died. Story 52. PA here. Lady came in for a normal lab follow-up visit, complaining about her legs feeling numb. Labs are all normal, leg exam is normal. Go to examine her abdomen and she refused because I'm fat and trying to lose some weight. Ask her when was the last time anyone has examined her abdomen. Oh, it's been a few years. Insist on the abdominal exam. Giant mass palpated went from her pubic bone to her ribs. Stat CT, ovarian tumor, 43 centimeters by 36 centimeters by 23 centimeters. She had a large, thankfully benign, tumor baby. One surgery later and she was 40 pounds lighter and her legs weren't numb anymore. 40 pounds! That is not just a tumor baby, that's a whole freaking tumor Mormon family. Story 53. Not a doctor, but a patient. I was like 10 or so and was really into magic at the time. I did those lame tricks where you have to ask your mom to turn around and then bam, something appears when they turn the back. Yeah, I was a cool kid. Anyway, one time just before bed, I found a crystal that was quite small and I thought, oh yeah, I'm gonna do a pull something out of my ear trick. So I put the crystal in my ear a tiny bit and went to show my mom the trick. I do some abracadabra crap and go to take the crystal out of my ear. I press my finger against the crystal by accident and it goes into my ear canal. I start freaking out like, oh geez, there's a stone in my friggin' ear hole and my mom says it'll probably come out in my sleep. It did not. Next day, we head to the docks and try to get out with the suction tube that dentists use for saliva. Didn't work. They referred me to a doctor who did the same thing. Didn't work. Again, sent me to another doc and he tried it again. The doc said, we're gonna have to cut his ear open. They sent me to the hospital called York Hill Children's Hospital and I was to stay there overnight. They take me in for surgery and they're about to put a needle in my arm, so what was I to do? I flipped and went bananas. They took me back to the ward I was staying in and they offered me a can of cola. My spidey senses start tingling. They're going to drug me. I ran fast, and I mean I sprinted like Usain Bolt. I had my mom and about 3 nurses trying to catch me. I ran through near enough the entire hospital and I found it hilarious. After about 20 minutes of this, they catch me and the nurses and my mom start giving me into trouble. I felt bad, so agreed to go back to my ward. The nurse gave me half a can of cola and offered me $1 if I could chug it fast. Easy bet, I thought. I chugged that Coke like it was the last can on the planet. She said she would be back in a minute to give me my winnings. So in the meantime, me and my mom played Dora the Explorer on GameCube. They had a games room next to my ward. I thought this would be a great time to run away again. Wrong. I fell flat on my face. They had done it. They had taken down the beast. Turns out she spiked my cola and wanted me to down it so I wouldn't taste whatever they put in it. When my mom tells this story, she says after I fell, I started screaming something to the effect of, "You guys, you drugged me!" The nurse said she had never heard a 10-year-old be so dramatic. Turns out they never had to cut my ear open and just used the suction tube again, but because I was asleep, they could really get in there. Now I have about 90% hearing in one ear and the other is fine. The nurse never did give me that $1. Too long didn't read, I jammed a crystal in my ear canal, Doctors tried to suck it out. Docs tell my mom they have to cut my ear open. I run away like a madman, and the nurses had to spike my cola to knock me out, and never received the $1 I was promised. Do you hear what I hear? Little child running through the ER. Well, I know I can only hear it at 90%. That is the exact kind of personality you expect a magician to have, so I hope he's still doing tricks. Story 54. Wow, timely. Like many here, I'm the patient. Went to see my primary around Thanksgiving last year for a cold I'd had for 3 or 4 weeks that kept lingering. He orders a chest x-ray to check for pneumonia. It comes back clean for pneumonia, but they do see a mass in my one lung. A couple of additional scans later, CT and PET, endless other blood and urine samples, EKGs and stress tests, and more chest x-rays than I thought possible, I had a tumor removed 2 weeks ago from the lung. Crazy lucky, stage 1 cancer, clean lymph nodes, and they didn't need to take the whole lower lobe as they were thinking. Lots of CT scans to come for at least the next 10 years, but I'll take it. If you're looking for something to be thankful for around the holiday season, looks like it worked out for you. Story 55. Not a doctor, med student here. This happened during my 3rd year. A 17-year-old came in with slight pain in her abdomen which worsened during the examination and was diagnosed as a case of an acute abdomen. She was rushed into emergency surgery for an appendectomy. Turns out she had stomach cancer that had metastasized to almost the entire peritoneum, a good portion of the intestines, uterus, ovaries, spinal column, and was creeping towards her lungs. She survived the appendectomy and subsequent surgeries but passed away 2 months later. Story 56. Orthopedic surgeon here. This is some of the stuff of my nightmares. A young, relatively healthy patient. 28-year-old guy came to our hospital for an MRI of his lower abdomen and pelvis after a persistent core muscle injury, sports hernia. These are typically things that heal pretty well if you just rest and take it easy. Sometimes, very rarely, they need surgery. He was being worked up by a physician not associated with us or the hospital at all. It was just the most convenient place for the guy to get the MRI. So he's in the machine, probably miserable because it takes forever and is loud and banging, and just the fact that going to do anything medical sucks. To get the right pictures, the technologist moves him in and out a few times, taking different sequences of images. This particular tech is pretty experienced and sees something that looks off. He calls the radiologist to quickly look through the images to see if he wants more or different images. The radiologist immediately called our team. There was a huge mass in this guy's pelvis right around his hip joint. This is not an area where you get a lot of benign tumors in young people. We quickly look through the MRI. Meanwhile, this guy is lying on some beds, staring at the ceiling, wondering when he'll be done and can get back to work. We go to talk to him at length about what we're looking at and immediately have him admitted for an expedited workup of what we think is sarcoma, particularly some kind of chondrosarcoma. He agrees, is freaking the heck out and visibly shaken by what's happening, gets admitted and has a biopsy done the next day along with a full battery of tests to help us know what this is and to see if there's any evidence of tumors anywhere else in his body. A week later, our suspicions of chondrosarcoma is confirmed and he's scheduled for surgery. The type and stage of his cancer is not one that responds to chemotherapy or radiation. His best chance is surgery, a very, very big surgery. He undergoes an internal hemipelvectomy with a complete reconstruction of part of his pelvis and hip. It looks something like this. He was in the hospital for about a week and inpatient rehab for about 2 weeks after that. 3 years later, there's no sign of reoccurrence and he walks without a cane. He's not very worried about his sports hernia anymore. That has got to be like the worst news and the best news. You know, like you go in for a little thing that's already annoying and inconvenient just to find out that there's a lot of surgeries and a lot of risk going through. But going through the story and how like much buildup there was, I thought for sure he was going to die. So I'm just glad he made it through and, you know, go get checked out, I guess, is the moral of all these stories, really. Story 58. I kind of have 2 of these. I'm not the doctor, but a patient. The first, I was 13 and my hip was bothering me for a little while. They took x-rays and I was sitting on the weird bed table thing talking to my mom. When they came into the room, I went to hop off the table and the 2 nurses started panicking, saying, No, you need to be more careful. You need to be in a wheelchair. So they put me in a wheelchair, brought my mom and I to the x-rays, and sure enough, there was a hairline fracture that had nearly made it through my hip right under the ball. I went in for surgery about 2 weeks later. The next one doesn't involve surgery, but it did have an unexpected twist. I was 16 years old, and my sister and I went into our family doctor because we both had a cold. During their questions, they asked for the last time if I'd menstruated, and I said I hadn't. They then did a pap smear to make sure nothing was immediately wrong, then sent me to a specialist. I got my blood drawn, had another pap smear done, had an MRI, more blood tests, and finally an ultrasound that confirmed I don't have ovaries. My uterus is there, but no ovaries. Boy, was that a shock.